Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're doing well. Today, we are going to be looking and listening to Toldinstone, the story of Atlantis. Um, this is a three-part video. We're going to do all parts in the same video since it seems, it seems best to do it this way. Glad you're here. If you guys have any opinions about Atlantis, put down below. We're going to start off with part one, what Plato said, which is pretty much the genesis of the Atlantis history, I would say. So let's go.
Everyone's heard of Atlantis. It's an overpriced resort in the Bahamas, the home address of Aquaman, namesake of a surprising number of aquatic-themed strip clubs, and, of course, a mythical ancient city that ended up very wet.
Mythical as in an ostracized adjective to that, because there's so much out there, and I don't know, like, the populace thoughts on this. I bet you it's like a 50-50. Like, if you'd ask our average person if Atlantis ever existed. When you go into, like, the educational and, like, the historians, it kind of skews to, like, 20-80. 20% say it might have been. 80% says there's no real evidence. I tend to think that it's a parallel to something that happened. But we're not going to get into substance yet. Let's jump right in.
Atlantis, in short, has great brand recognition. But there seems to be quite a bit of popular confusion about where the story of Atlantis comes from, whether Atlantis was real, and why people make such a big deal about this soggiest of civilizations. Clarifying all this sounds like a job for questions about ancient Greece and Rome you were afraid to ask in school.
Well, this isn't necessarily, I'm not going to jump out in front of a bus on this statement, but I'm going to say it's not necessarily a Greek or Roman city. It could have been. It could have been.
As my dedicated band of subscribers knows, the videos on this channel are usually short, sweet, and self-contained. For the next 3 episodes, however, I'd like to try something different. A sort of mini-series on Atlantis. This first video will discuss the origins of the Atlantis story. The second will explore modern quests for Atlantis. The third will focus on the theory that the Atlantis story was inspired by a colossal Bronze Age eruption. Together, these videos will hopefully provide a fast-paced but reasonably thorough overview of the myth and mystique of Atlantis. So, without any further ado, let's dive in. The story of Atlantis begins with Plato. Plato was born into one of Athens' leading families. He was a brilliant student, a gifted poet, and a champion wrestler. With this resume, he seemed destined for great things, until he fell under the unlikely spell of Socrates. At first glance, Socrates was far from inspiring. He was long-haired, unkempt, and considered the ugliest man in Athens. Since he refused to engage in a profession other than philosophy, he spent most of his time strolling barefoot in public places, engaging anything that stood still long enough in endless discussions about courage, piety, and the like.
We need more people like philosophers. We need more people. I feel like today's time's so fast-paced, there's not a lot of time of people just standing and thinking and spreading conversation where, it's so headline-induced today.
To Plato and a small group of other philosophically inclined youths, he was a fascinating friend and inspiring teacher. Most other Athenians, however, regarded him as a nuisance and a potential menace. In 399 BC, during a period...
What year?
And a potential menace. In 399 BC,
89.
During a period of political unrest, a jury condemned Socrates to death on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens.
Really? I didn't even know that.
Though able to escape, he chose to accept the penalty, and, after about a month in prison, he calmly drank a fatal dose of hemlock.
I didn't know that.
The execution of Socrates convinced Plato to devote his life to philosophy. Inspired by the Socratic habit of seeking truth through discussion, Plato presented his ideas in the form of dialogues, that is, conversations between 2 or more characters. The most important speaker is almost always Socrates. Plato himself never appears. the reader is simply presented with a long and detailed discussion of some philosophical concept, and left to puzzle out its implications as best he can. This format allowed Plato to explore complex issues without committing himself to a single interpretation. Equally importantly, it drew readers into the conversation, urging them to consider the issues at stake for themselves. The two dialogues that describe Atlantis, the Timaeus and the Critias, are among the last Plato wrote. Both reflect his deep interest in politics. Earlier in his career, in his famous Republic, Plato had described a utopian society. In his old age, however, he seems to have become increasingly interested in the practical problems of governing a city. The Timaeus and the Critias are products of this new approach to the perfect state. The Timaeus, presented as a continuation of the Republic, features Socrates and three other characters. Socrates begins the dialogue by summarizing the ideal society outlined in the Republic. Their discussion, he suggests, is incomplete, since they have yet to consider how effective such a city would be in a crisis. One of the other characters, Critias, replies that he knows a relevant example. An ancestor of his, Critias continues, once visited Egypt. There his ancestor fell into discussion with some priests, who told him that their records preserved many things the Greeks had long since forgotten.
Really?
9,000 years before, the priest said, Athens had been a great city. The ancient Athenians had performed many noble deeds, but their most famous exploit was the defeat of the mighty empire of Atlantis. The ancient Athenians had performed many noble deeds, but their most famous exploit was the defeat of the mighty empire of Atlantis. The Atlanteans, the priest continued, came from a great island in the far west, and had conquered much of Europe and North Africa. When they sought to add Greece to their empire, however, the Athenians repeatedly defeated them, and finally led a war to liberate Europe from Atlantean tyranny. Not long after this victory, both ancient Athens and Atlantis were destroyed by terrible earthquakes and floods. A few Athenians survived by fleeing to the mountains, but Atlantis was destroyed utterly and sank beneath the waves.
Sank beneath the waves.
Critias provides more detail in the next dialogue, which is named after him. Atlantis, he says, was founded by Poseidon, god of the sea, who set 10 of his mortal sons on the thrones of its 10 kingdoms. To the eldest of his children, Poseidon gave an awesome natural fortress, surrounded by concentric moats of seawater. This became the heart of the Atlanteans' greatest city, and was duly crowned with a great temple of Poseidon. Around the metropolis stretched a vast plain, traversed and irrigated by a network of canals. In times of war, Atlantis' chief kingdom could muster a navy of 1,200 ships and an army of well over 1,000,000 men.
1,000,000 men. That's. I'm not trying to follow this with any legitimacy of the obvious number that there was no 1,000,000 men. We know that.
The other 9 kingdoms were equally populous and powerful. The 10 kings of Atlantis, however, always maintained a truce among themselves, meeting every few years to sacrifice bulls to Poseidon and confirm their alliance. The Atlanteans grew steadily in wealth and might. In time, however, they became corrupt, and the gods were stirred to anger. Zeus convened a heavenly council, and the dialogue ends. Plato never finished the dialogue, and never mentioned Atlantis again.
But it seems like he was speaking through a third-party source from a first-party source. It seems that he was speaking on behalf of someone who's visited Egypt, on behalf of the Egyptian source of another behalf of like an ancient. It seems there's like a circular conversation here, unless I missed something, where Plato is engaging with one of his contemporaries who visited Egypt, and Egypt is speaking to that contemporary about hidden, forgotten knowledge that wraps back to the ancient Athenians. However, we don't have a time frame necessarily in this conversation, but ancient is more or less relevant to the time. There could be 100 years. It could be 1,000 years. It could be Bronze Age collapse. I don't know.
So, why did Plato incorporate a detailed story about a lost island empire into two of his dialogues? Did he really believe Atlantis existed? And if he didn't, why not make it clear to his readers that Atlantis was fictional?
It's unclear.
Atlantis was a parable. Plato's dialogues are designed to engage readers, and so lead them to the benefits of philosophy. In keeping with this purpose, Plato sometimes has one of his characters tell a story that illustrates or otherwise complements a discussion. Some of these stories are framed as myths or allegories. Others, though obviously fictional, are described as true. As a writer of dialogues, Plato did not have to commit himself to the truth of any of these tales. He could simply put a story in a character's mouth and treat it as a point for discussion. Wanting to explore how an ideal state would function in time of war, Plato described ancient Athens as a virtuous and well-governed city. He invented Atlantis, mighty but corrupt, as a counterexample. Atlantis, in short, was an illustration of how not to govern. It may have also been a caricature of contemporary Athens, which Plato regarded as badly managed and morally bankrupt.
Really?
But whatever else it was not a description of any actual place.
Seems that
So,
way.
there you have it.
That's interesting.
Atlantis was a product of Plato's imagination. Widespread belief in Atlantis is a modern phenomenon, begun by a failed American politician in the 1880s, and carried through the 20th century by an eclectic cast of
What American politician?
psychics, Nazis, treasure hunters, and true believers.
Nicolas Cage. All right, so that's the first one. We're going to jump right into the second one, which is searching for Atlantis. So we might get some of these accounts.
Hello again, and welcome to the second part of our mini-series on Atlantis. As we saw in the first video, the Atlantis story comes from two dialogues of Plato, which describe a vast and powerful civilization drowned in the distant past. Modern classicists agree that Plato invented Atlantis in the service of a philosophical parable. But over the centuries, there have been many people who wanted to believe that there was some kernel of truth in Plato's story. There is no sign that anyone who actually knew Plato thought Atlantis was real.
Well, yeah, because you would have the contemporary context.
That idea emerged later, as philosophers studying and commenting on Plato's works evolved various theories about their meaning. By late antiquity, there were three schools of thought. Some philosophers theorized that the Atlantis story was literal truth. Others regarded it as an outright fable. Still others saw it as a more or less convoluted allegory. All this, however, was purely academic. No Greek or Roman ever went looking for Atlantis.
That we know of.
Atlantis resurfaced after the European discovery of the New World. Several scholars
Okay, so like 1500s, 1400s.
suggested that America was Plato's Atlantis, and that the Native Americans were descendants of the Atlanteans. Others speculated that Atlantis had been a land bridge between America and Europe. One of these was the Jesuit polymath Athanasius Kircher, who thought the Canary Islands were the shattered remains of a lost continent, and commissioned a famous map showing Atlantis in the center of the Atlantic Ocean. The most comprehensive work of early modern Atlantology was produced by the Swedish scholar Olof Rudbeck, who deployed a heady blend of primitive archaeology and misapplied linguistics to demonstrate that Atlantis had actually been located in Sweden. Perhaps foreseeably, Rudbeck's 3,000-page manifesto was much more popular in Sweden than elsewhere. Over the next 150 years, various and variously unconvincing attempts were made to locate Atlantis in places as far afield as the Andes, the Arctic, and the Yucatan. The public paid little attention. It was only in the late 19th century that belief in Atlantis went mainstream, and this was almost entirely due to a single man, an American named Ignatius Donnelly.
Never heard of him.
By the time he wrote the book that made Atlantis a household name, Donnelly had suffered through several careers. He had abandoned his practice as a lawyer, gone bankrupt as a land speculator, and been voted out of Congress.
By the way, I just want to put this point out. Can we normalize not discounting person's merits based off of failed businesses. I think that's such a that's such a small like I don't think. Never mind. No, not never mind. Let's focus more on what someone says and what someone does, not what the economy does to a business.
At first sight, his book on Atlantis seemed no more likely to succeed. It was almost 500 pages long, full of references to obscure scientific literature, and written on a topic that most people had barely heard of. But when it appeared in 1882, it was a runaway bestseller. The book became so popular, in fact, that the theme of the 1883 Mardi Gras celebration in New Orleans was Atlantis. Donnelly's book would go through dozens of printings in the next decade alone. It remains in print today. Atlantis, Donnelly claimed, had been a large island off the coast of Spain. The Atlanteans had
Oh my gosh.
invented writing, bronze-working, and rather a lot else before colonizing most of the world. After a disaster destroyed the island of Atlantis, the survivors preserved memories, often disguised as myths, of their great and vanished civilization. The pyramids of Egypt and Central America, the Phoenician alphabet and Mayan hieroglyphs, the Garden of Eden, Mount Olympus, and much, much more were all, Donnelly insisted, legacies of Atlantis.
Yeah, this is like who would believe this though? I mean, I say that, but it does not have any like breadcrumbs that make sense, because how would these people get to Atlantis? As we know, humans came from Africa. So like I don't know, man. It's hard it's hard for me to wrap my head around that this became commonality.
This, of course, was completely wrong. Even in 1882, it was clear that there was no real evidence, geological, archaeological, or otherwise, for a lost continent or prehistoric supercivilization. But the idea of an ancient empire lost beneath the waves was too fascinating to ignore. Many came to believe in Atlantis. Many still do. Modern Atlantis enthusiasts tend to share a few basic assumptions. Most agree that Atlantis was an advanced seafaring civilization which flourished in the twilight before recorded history and was destroyed by a cataclysm that flooded its heartland.
And that's such a convenient factor, right? Before recorded history. So it can be pointed to, we don't have the evidence. But and then there's an opposite contradiction. There's lack of evidence isn't evidence. Lack thereof of evidence isn't. See, I messed that up. Never mind.
On these articles of faith are founded countless theories, none very compelling. Perhaps the most remarkable of Donnelly's many successors was an American psychic named Edgar Cayce, known to his followers as the Sleeping Prophet. Cayce surprised many of his clients with the news that they'd enjoyed past lives in Atlantis,
Of course they
which
did.
he described as a world-spanning ancient empire with advanced technology powered, you guessed it, by crystals.
Also, another thing to point out: psychics are con people. If you believe in psychics, fight me.
The Atlanteans had destroyed themselves through overindulgence in crystal-driven superweapons, but records of their great civilization, Cayce insisted, were hidden beneath the Sphinx in Egypt, in the Mayan ruins of the Yucatan, and among the coral reefs of the Caribbean. A few hopeful souls are still seeking the impossible truth in these unlikely places. The most notorious Atlantis hunters of the 20th century were the scholars of the Ahnenerbe, a Nazi think tank dedicated to researching and publicizing the Aryan roots of German civilization. Heinrich Himmler, who founded the Ahnenerbe as an arm of the SS, was obsessed with the idea that a highly advanced Nordic empire had existed before the dawn of recorded time.
Nordic Empire. So is he relying heavily on this guy right here? Seems that way.
To researching and publicizing the Aryan roots of German civilization. Heinrich Himmler, who founded the Ahnenerbe as an arm of the SS, was obsessed with the idea that a highly advanced Nordic empire had existed before the dawn of recorded time, and came to be convinced that the homeland of this empire was the island later known as Atlantis. Nazi scholars were sent to various corners of the world to gather evidence for the Nordic roots of civilization, and an expedition was planned to discover Atlantean remains in the Canaries. The Second World War, however, put an end to the Anna Nerva's vicious brand of pseudoscience. Over the past 70 years, countless theories have been proposed about the location and fate of Atlantis. Most of these ignore history, science, and everything between. A bare handful are more careful. But only one has been taken seriously by classicists: the theory that Plato's Atlantis story was partly inspired by a catastrophic Bronze Age eruption. For that theory, tune in next time.
All right, let's get to part 3, Bronze Age. This is going to be called the Minoan hypothesis. Of course, the Minoans off Greece.
Hello again, and welcome to the third and final installment in our series on Atlantis. As we saw in the first video, Atlantis was a political allegory, born from the philosophical imagination of Plato. As we saw in the second video, this fact has not prevented people from believing Atlantis was real, and devising all sorts of unlikely theories about the identity and fate of the Atlanteans. Classical scholars ignore pretty much all of these, with a single noteworthy exception:
Really?
the Minoan hypothesis. The Minoan hypothesis suggests that Plato modeled Atlantis on Minoan Crete. The Minoans were a prosperous Bronze Age civilization, famous for the colossal palaces that served as their ritual and economic centers. For half a millennium they flourished, establishing close trade links with Egypt and the Near East. Then, toward the end of the Bronze Age, almost every Minoan palace was destroyed by fire, and invaders from mainland Greece settled among the ruins. The best-known version of the Minoan hypothesis was proposed by an Irish classicist named John Luce. Luce thought that both the glorious reign and catastrophic end of Minoans were echoed in the Atlantis story. Pointing to some Minoan-looking customs in the Critias, he suggested that either Plato or one of his ancestors had traveled to Egypt, and there encountered a garbled description of Minoan Crete that became the basis of the Atlantis story. It was also in Egypt, Luce believed, that Plato learned of the disaster that destroyed Minoan civilization, the eruption of the Thera volcano. The island of Thera, located about 90 miles north of Crete, is better known as Santorini.
Yeah.
Every summer, thousands of sunburnt visitors shuffle up and down the whitewashed streets of its towns, squinting appreciatively at the towering black cliffs and turquoise bay. This picturesque landscape, a favorite of Greek tourist brochures, was created 36 centuries ago by a volcanic eruption of almost incomprehensible violence. We have no accounts of the Thera eruption. Some idea of its intensity, however, is provided by descriptions of Krakatoa, the Indonesian volcano that famously tore itself to pieces in August 1883. Even from a distance of 30 or 40 miles, that eruption was apocalyptic. Falling ash shrouded the sun. Beneath the sudden gloom, the sea, led by eerie tendrils of static lightning, churned uneasily. Hour after hour, the air shuddered with percussive blasts. When 4 colossal explosions finally shattered the volcano, tsunamis up to 150 feet high roared into the neighboring coasts. The final explosion was heard over 3,000 miles away and generated a pressure wave that traveled around the world 3 times before dissipating. The 6 cubic miles of dust pulverized by the eruption lingered for months in the upper atmosphere, crimsoning sunsets worldwide and depressing the average global temperature by a degree Fahrenheit for the following year. The eruption of Thera was considerably more powerful than Krakatoa's. Although few scholars now think that the eruption was directly responsible for the fall of the Minoans, all agree that it had serious impacts around the Aegean. Is it reasonable to assume, then, that Plato's Atlantis story was inspired by the devastation Thera caused on Minoan Crete?
Possible.
Probably not. First, there is the awkward fact that Crete bears no resemblance to Plato's Atlantis. Crete is not located in the Atlantic Ocean, is not the size of a continent.
That though, do they really know what Atlantic Ocean is though? You know, right? Because there's so, like, they thought Australia, they called the southernmost continent Australia, and they also thought that there was an equal amount of land on the earth as water. So names and what we think is very different. So,
and does not, as Plato claims of Atlantis, have herds of elephants cavorting on its plains. Second, despite evidence for tsunamis and widespread ash falls, Minoan civilization survived the eruption of Thera. Although the eruption's date is disputed, it almost certainly occurred sometime between 1650 and 1600 BC, well over a century before the burning of the Minoan palaces. Finally, it is hard to see how any description of Minoan Crete or the eruption of Thera could have reached Plato. If there had been a tradition known to the Greeks about a great civilization on Crete and its sudden destruction, there would be traces of it in other ancient sources. But there are none. The Minoan hypothesis, in short, can be dismissed. This does not mean, however, that Atlantis was invented out of thin air. Take, for example, Plato's famous claim that Atlantis vanished after a single day and night of earthquakes and floods. Twice in Plato's lifetime, parts of Greece have been visited by similar-looking disasters. In 426 BC, an earthquake and tsunami devastated a small island intriguingly called Atalante. And in 373 BC, about 20 years before Plato wrote the Timaeus and Critias, an earthquake, triggered supposedly by the wrath of Poseidon, caused the entire city of Helike to sink into the sea.
I wonder why these things don't happen as much in the last 100 years. You know?
The drowned city, visible under the water, became a tourist attraction, and for centuries, local fishermen snagged their nets on a submerged statue of Poseidon among the ruins. Perhaps the fate of Helike inspired Plato to drown Atlantis. Or perhaps the terrible flood and earthquake described in the Timaeus were just literary flourishes. All that matters is this: Plato invented Atlantis. He can never have imagined how many would be misled by his parable.
Is there other parables of Plato that are widely characterized and just swung with? There are tons and tons of today theorists and what have you that will still believe this. I'm on the 20%. I'm on the 2080. Like there's a 20% chance something parallel could have been true, because words and thoughts are inspiration. You can trip on acid and come up with something brand new, but every word that you've ever said is part of a tree of knowledge, and that knowledge is derived from something, whether it be true or false or something like that. The thought of a city sinking into the ocean is not 100% science fiction, right? We've shown that with some of the examples that he listed at the very end. So it's not too far-fetched to think that there wasn't a parallel of what Atlantis is. And words, like I said before, like a lot of people, they would just say, for example, like Anatolia was Asia, right? The Turkey, right there, for the longest part, that was Asia. For Libya, Tunisia, that area was called Africa, and so forth, right? So like names are so much, they're goalposts, they move. I mean, so there's that 20% rule in my head. Like there's a 20% chance that something could have been parallel to this allegory, because this allegory could have meant something with substance. It could have been also just fun, fable, whatever. But still, like the question isn't if there is obviously no evidence so far that a place called Atlantis within the constructs of like the circular nature and all that. There's no real evidence, concrete, unified evidence that that's ever existed. However, it could be something. It could be something. So we'll leave it there. Thank you guys for watching. Do you believe in Atlantis? Let me know. I'll see you guys next time. Peace out. Bye-bye.